Hello, everyone. It is week 3, and this week is about community assessment and evaluation of partnership through your readings. Your week 3 agenda is listed here. You will be reading chapters 5, 6, and 13 this week. The CBPR article presentations are continuing this week. As a reminder, the presenters are listed in week 1, so they will post their presentation by Thursday, and any students that aren't presenting will comment on at least 2 presentations and respond to the discussion questions by Sunday. And the discussion questions are those questions on the last slide that the presenters post. Quiz 2 will be available Wednesday morning, and there may be some information for quiz 2 that's in this presentation, so you want to make sure you listen to this whole thing. And the last item is weekly writing time with an assignment due. So this week you're working on your interview guide and protocol. This will be discussed in the next slides. You will be drafting questions that you think are relevant to better understanding your um, community leader or principal investigator, whoever you may be interviewing, and the community's health needs. So preparing for your interview, before you begin the interview, you will want to start reaching out to your potential interviewees. If you haven't already done so, please start doing that. Please do so in a professional manner. And as a reminder, you are making professional connections and representing Cal State San Marcos. For the location of the interview with COVID, there are new considerations to have. So if Zoom or other virtual call or meeting is available, you're welcome to do so. Or if meeting in person is best, this might depend on what works best for them. You will want to do so safely with social distancing and masks. This will all be dependent on who the person is that you are interviewing and what they are comfortable with. So try to adapt to them since they're giving you their time for the interview. You'll also want to think if there are cultural considerations that need to be considered, and this may vary by the community involved in the CBPR work of your interviewee, especially if you are interviewing a community leader or community member. You'll just want to keep that in mind. So last week, during week 2, you identified your community of interest, you identified some potential community leaders to interview, and you've started bulleting some health outcomes or behaviors that may be of concern for the community. Also, you started thinking about some potential CBPR related processes that might be of concern or interest to you. So this could be something like starting partnerships, sharing data, ensuring equity within the research study, following cultural protocols. So any of those sort of processes related to CBPR. So this should help you formulate some of your questions and be prepared for any follow-up in your interview that might come up. However, you do want the person to lead during the interview, so you are getting their perspective. But this information gives you a chance to be more familiar with potential concerns. So we will discuss more of this interview protocol and guide in the next slide. Also, before the interview, so you want to have your interview guide with questions and prompts and a clear goal in mind. This is based on that prior research you're doing this week or during week 2. You also want to know who the person is you are interviewing, the community, or if you know about the project, that is helpful too. So just some basic research that you've started to do. You'll want to have that in mind. All of your goals for your interview will vary based on what you learned during your research. So one student might have a goal to learn more about, getting started in the research process and developing partnerships, kind of those early on phases. Another student may have selected a more established research project in their community. So they may be more interested in something like, how is data and information shared? How does this get translated for the community to better understand? Something more along those phases. So you want to think about the different phases of CBPR and the principles that you are reading about. Then think about how this might work into your interview and what you want to learn from the interviewee. So are you interested in those early stages or more later on in the process? Just kind of have that in mind as you start to develop these questions. Also, are there any specific health outcomes that you think might be addressed? Anything in the process that interests you and you're curious about how it plays out in a CBPR setting? These are just all little questions to get you thinking about what is your goal for this interview. Now, during the actual interview, you don't want to just dive right in. You should build up rapport, start with some small talk, and make the setting comfortable. So if this was an actual research project, you would need IRB consent. And this is when you would typically have the consent, which you don't need for this interview, but just so you're aware of that process. But you will want to start by setting some expectations, thank them for taking the time to meet with you, and let them know what your goal is for the interview. So, for example, you could say that this is a community or a project you've been interested in. Your goal is to understand how to build partnerships and ensure equity in community based research settings. Something along those lines, and make sure your goal is really clear. This will help during your question development and keeping you on track during the interview. You also want to provide a bit of a timeline and give this up front, especially when first scheduling the meeting. So tell them you have 5 to 6 questions and it should take maybe 30 to 45 minutes. You also want to be realistic in this. So this is done by gauging the time it'll take ahead of time. So after you develop your guide and protocol, you're going to want to practice those questions and see how long it really takes. This can help to knowing with the flow of the interview. Like, did the questions make sense, the order they're in, that sort of thing, which we'll discuss a little later. So for notes or recording, I recommend that you record so you don't miss anything and you can really focus on the interview. But please make sure to ask the person for consent prior to doing so. I'm sure most of you will be doing virtual interviews, so this should be easy to record via Zoom or your phone if you have to. I also suggest testing out any equipment, recording, Zoom meetings, Google Hangouts, or however you decide to meet. Just test that out ahead of time so you're familiar with the recording or the equipment or whatever you're going to use. You know that the sound of the recording is going to come out ahead of time, that sort of thing. You just want to test out those. And you can still take some notes while interviewing. This is helpful, just jotting down little notes as the person is talking, a point that you want to come back to or follow up on, that can be helpful. If you are meeting in person, it's always nice to bring some water or a snack. But if you're going virtual, also make sure that you look professional, your background isn't too crazy, there's a bunch of stuff going on behind you, or that it's not too noisy. So just think about those things ahead of time. And lastly, you'll want to follow up after the interview with a thank you note or email. And then we will start working on writing up the results during week 5. So the writing time for week 3, the assignment that you will be submitting by Sunday for week 3 is writing the actual interview guide and protocol. So there will be a sample posted in the Cougar course, and you can adapt some of those questions if they apply to your goal. But please be purposeful of what the goal of your interview is, because this is going to determine the questions you ask. The style of this interview is going to be semi-structured. So there are types of interviews that are more open-ended where you may sit down and ask someone a question like, tell me more about your community. But this question could lead the interview in any direction. So you want to have your 5 to 6 questions that are really focused on your goal. So for the semi-structured interview that we're going for, you'll have that set of questions to keep you on track. It may go in some different directions, and that's okay. That's great. And you may have a few follow-up questions, but you have those main questions that'll help you stay on track. So this will also help create some themes from these questions since you're writing them down with this goal in mind. So first you will start out with your introduction. So I'm here to learn more about XYZ, and through your work with this community, I'm looking forward to learning more from you, something along those lines. And then you'll also want to include some prompts. These are great to have in your back pocket to really get a conversation going. So these are phrases like, can you expand on this idea? Or can you tell me more about X? You want to try not to do most of the talking. The idea is to prompt the interviewee for more information if possible. You also want to make sure you aren't leading questions in a particular way or giving the answers to your questions. So the interviewee might be a bit nervous and may not talk too much. So prompts that you have on hand can help get the conversation going. You should include at least one question on cultural intelligence. And this is going to depend on the phase that you are targeting. It might be something like, what is the best way to recruit in this community? What is something that should be considered when conducting an intervention or an evaluation with your community? Something that helps gauge what would be helpful when engaging a community, this specific community in CBPR. So this might be culturally appropriate communication methods or strategies, some sort of consideration that is specific to that community and or the partnerships. And then at the end of your guide, you'll want a section for notes. So make sure you look at the sample and courses. This one does include an informed consent, so you can see what that looks like, but you will not need that for your interview. I also recommend you search online for other qualitative interview guides or examples, but make sure you have the items that were listed here. So you need to have that intro, a few prompts, 5 to 6 questions, and then a section for notes. So the last thing, don't forget to practice. You'll want to test the questions to make sure they make sense when you're asking someone. Also, if the order makes sense for the flow of the interview and the timing purposes. So your interview will be due Sunday night of week 3. You are welcome to adjust it after you submit it. So if you don't get a chance to practice it before submitting it, that's totally fine. You can practice it and make changes prior to your actual interview. The goal this week is just that you have an interview guide posted and on hand so you are prepared and can get started and hopefully have your interview scheduled. So thank you all. I look forward to seeing your interview guides and the questions that you're coming up with. If you have any questions for me, as always, just feel free to reach out.